All right, Psalm 37, let's call this one While You Wait for Justice. Understanding that in the last chapter, we talked about the way in which genuinely knowing God involves developing a love for justice. But in this chapter, we'll get a chance to see the practical ways in which loving justice comes along with a lot of frustration, understanding that it might be best to look at this lengthy chapter from the perspective of some terms that come up over and over again. And one of those warnings or terms that comes up over and over again is don't fret, because it can be really frustrating hoping for God's justice when it's something we actually care about. Understanding that it starts off in verse 1, fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers. As once again in verse 7, it's going to say, be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Fret not yourself over the one who prospers in his way, before going on to say that again in verse 8, where it says, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. The dangers or evils in fretting over wickedness potentially being at least twofold. One, being provoked to retaliate, repeating the same evil that was actually done to you, which is simply baiting you to actually just do evil, something that will then draw God's judgment. But in Psalm 73, it's going to talk about a different peril, as we mentioned, where it's going to say in verse 3 of Psalm 73, for I was envious of the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. It's going to go on in verse 10 to say, therefore his people turn back to them and find no fault in them. The second danger seems to be in seeing wrongdoing go unchecked, thinking that wrongdoing has all of a sudden become okay. Two things that we have mentioned in the past that Psalm 37 brings back to mind, but God's remedy is what might differ in this psalm, where God goes on to discuss the divergent futures of the wicked and those who have the or find the strength to wait on God's response to what they are doing. Understanding that just as many times as he mentions waiting and not being frustrated or fretting, he is going to talk about the heritage or the inheritance of the meek. Once again, not the weak, not those who feel overwhelmed by a situation. Understand that David has felt overwhelmed by plenty of his adversaries or enemies. Even though he had the strength and the courage to face Goliath, he was overwhelmed in some circumstances. But there are likewise times when David felt empowered to handle his own business. Understanding that twice God delivered Saul into David's hand, and in meekness, not weakness, David chose not to kill Saul. And so he is saying, for the meek, understand there's a future in verse 11. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. Not the kind of peace that is temporarily set off by getting even with your adversaries, only to provoke a war of retaliation. No, once again, Psalm 37 talks about the lasting peace that comes with God's response to wrongdoing, where again, it's going to talk about in verse 18, the Lord knows the days of the blameless and their heritage will remain forever. It's not, once again, a temporary peace that can be carved off by retaliation or carved out by retaliation. As again, he's going to talk in verse 22 about, for those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land, but those cursed by him shall be cut off. As again, for at least the fourth time, he's going to say in verse 29, the righteous shall inherit the land and dwell upon it forever. As we'll get a chance to see him combine that whole concept of waiting and inheriting in verse 34, where it reads, wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. You will look on when the wicked are cut off. Understanding that takes patience and strength. We have in the past asked God to give us the patience to wait patiently as he arranges circumstances in a way that provides us justice that goes along with a lasting peace. Understanding that even though we didn't spend a lot of time talking about the outline of the chapter, it is roughly an interchange between God's description of the future of the wicked and the future of the righteous. And as it begins its descent or its landing, it simply concludes this way in verse 37, making its way to verse 40. Mark the blameless and behold the upright, for there is a future for the man of peace.